Yeah. So just by way of introduction, two little bits. So I'm not sort of strictly a process theologian, but I'm sort of a baby of process theology. So Jay McDaniel, who was a student of John Cobb's, my college professor, Rosemary Ruther, and Marian Grau were both on my dissertation committee, and I've become friends, of course, with Catherine, and I worked with Phil Clayton at the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences back in the day. So I sort of imbibed a lot of process thought. So that's how I come to this. So that's a little intellectual bit of history, and then the sort of grounding bit of my context is that I live on one of the U.S. front lines of climate change. I actually live on Miami Beach, right on the ocean. I know, tough life. But I literally see the sunrise over the Atlantic Ocean every morning through my window. So we already have many times when we have what's called a king tide during a full moon. The streets of Miami Beach are flooded. They spent about $2 billion putting pumps in, the underground pumps down Alton Road, one of the main thoroughfares, and all they're doing is trying to push the water back out into the ocean, but there's nowhere for it to go. We can't build a seawall because we have limestone as our bedrock and it's porous, so on and so forth. So already water aquifers there are being salinated, so they're having to dig new water wells all over South Florida. So the economic forecast is that a mortgage will be good for about another 30 years. But if you're planning on buying in Florida after about 10 more years, and you're going to get a 30-year mortgage, that it'll never be worth anything because of the salination of groundwater. So that's sort of my context for thinking about religion and nature and all these sorts of things. I feel like I'm on one of the front lines, which is terrifying, but also kind of interesting to see what happens. Anyways, so, but today I won't be talking much about Miami. Instead, I'll be talking about prismatic identities. And I'm warning you there's a soundtrack to this paper, so I apologize for that already. So I start with a song that was popularized by Bette Midler. From a distance, we all have enough, and no one is in need, and there are no guns, no bombs, and no disease, no hungry mouths to feed. So the theology and lyrics of this song are precisely what this essay argues against. Who needs a God that watches us from a distance? Is this the same God watching genocides, species extinction, climate weirding, the lack of concern for black lives in this country, the AIDS crisis, torture, starvation, and the violence against animals in factory farms safely from his living room chair? If anything, process thought has encouraged us to think theologically not in broad stroke, but in pixels, fine print, and granularly. Redistributing agency and responsiveness to the smallest events of the world and to the largest societies of occasions, we're encouraged to pay close attention to both the particular and how the particulars relate to one another in the ongoing process of geoevolution and cosmic expansion. As Latour notes in Thou Shalt Not Freeze Frame, thoughts of God should not take us away, but should open us onto the particularities of life. What this calls for is something like Ivone Guevara's theology of the garbage and noise, rather than a whitewashed, sanitized theology. No connection to Whitehead, but in the brief time I have here, I just want to attempt a close-up theological method by focusing on the spectrum of colors and expanding on the eco-critic book, Prismatic Ecology, to talk about a prismatic eco-theology. Such a theology is informed by process, new materialisms, Jorg, and queer theory, just to name a few theoretical frequencies. What these all have in common is imagining our entire planetary existence as embedded in a single plane of existence, where all humans, animals, natures, technologies, ideas, and gods matter together. Not only do these events and objects matter for themselves, but for the entire planetary collective wobbling along in a helical motion around a star that is wobbling around a galaxy among other galaxies in an expanding universe. Rather than thinking ourselves as distant from the fray, we are embedded on the spectrum, looking around from our own place on the spectrum. So how might an eco-theology proceed prismatically from such a context? So part 1, color-filled thinking, or it's too easy to just be green. Kermit the Frog intended, okay. As with all tropes, being green started out in a revolutionary way for a certain time and place, but now has been co-opted in the form of greenwashing and placed in its context as a metaphor for mostly middle to upper class, whitish-looking folks of European and English descent. When we start to think about promoting a green understanding of environmentalism, we might conjure up images of a green English-style yard, which were imposed upon the landscape of the US and other colonies in an attempt to recreate the landscape in the image of the motherland. Or we might think of green parks, the history of which in the US conjure up images of removal of native peoples in order to create recreational spaces for white middle to upper class city dwellers, so that these people might escape the dirty city, read racially and culturally mixed city. One might also think of the rugged green and natural landscapes that the Boy Scouts of America used to try to prevent the sissification of boys in the city. Finally, green has affinities with a lopsided view of the world focused on birth, youth, and growth at the expense of death and decay. Death and decay are much harder sells when humans can't imagine themselves as part of the food chain. Yet this side of the equation, no resurrection without death, is just as important ecologically. In many ways, it turns out that Kermit the Frog might need to reconsider the lyrics to his song. It's pretty easy to be green. In a recent book entitled Prismatic Ecology, the authors seek to move us beyond green, pristine understandings of nature and explore the whole spectrum of colors for what that might mean ecologically. After all, green is only one color in nature, and there is nothing more natural than the full color spectrum, so why have we limited our metaphors and habits to green thinking? In the chapter on brown, for instance, the authors link the dirt with fecal matter and other waste. The humus, the source of all our nutrients, is, after all, nothing more than decay and waste. Smelly, rancid, and impure, it's no one's favorite color. Quoting, "We need brown, but do not like looking at it. It's a color you cannot cover up, that will never go away," end quote. To deny this is to deny the decay that is necessary for all life to continue. How much is spent on a daily basis to remove our waste from our daily sight, to remove the food we eat from its relationship with the earth and other life, and to secure our bodies from the rest of the natural world? Maybe a healthy look at our own waste and its relationship to other bodies could help us think ourselves back into the predator-prey cycle, something Val Plumwood tried to do after she was famously, or not so famously, I guess, if you don't know Val Plumwood, attacked by a crocodile. In yet another chapter, Orange, the author takes an object-oriented approach to discuss ecological relations. Quoting, "For color, like any complicated phenomenon, reveals itself to be a multiplicity, a knot in motion that connects different times and places in a structure of only apparent simultaneity." Okay. And so, at almost every moment, my orange ecology waxes in and out of being, revealing itself to be merely one orientation to a generalized prismatic archive, end quote. This type of understanding of the world and individuals therein highlights the individual in relation, similar to the process of process, or the idea from Deleuze and Guattari, or D&G, as I like to call them, that the virtual is the real. Dolce & Gabbana of philosophy, I guess. There are no colors without, although gay-friendly, I shouldn't use D&G anymore, I guess. But there are no colors without relation. There is no ecology without relation. Thingness is an abstraction from these sets of relations, whether an orange, a color, a tree, or an individual. There's realness at every level of life, all the way up, so to speak, and all the way down. As Graham Harman notes, from within this way of thinking, humans lose their place as the metaphysical core of the universe, but only because no object is allowed to occupy that core, including the inanimate sort. Instead, all objects are equally decentered, equally converted into just one object among others, end quote. This means, as the chapter Chartreuse, which is a lovely liqueur, not just a great color, suggests, and as Karen Barad has pointed out elsewhere, that all matter is agential. Having problems talking today. I blame 15 hours difference time jet lag, so there. In the end, the authors in Prismatic Ecology are trying to take us beyond a human-centered approach to the world and all the mastery that entails toward a post-green, post-color, post-human ecology. The post-color is not so much a denial or refusal of our particular embodiment as it is a spectral focus on the relationships of bodies, of our own with others, of the multiple bodies that make up our own, and on the ways in which these queer relations can only be understood when we abstract from them and create objections. So part 2, geographical mappings of meaning-making practices, or killing me slowly with values. I told you there was a soundtrack. Okay. Another component of dealing with brown and black in the ecological imagination is the contemporary fossil-fueled world in which we live. After all, fossil fuels are the death and decay of life gifted to future generations. They are, like the humus, the grounds from which new lives, hopes, dreams, and possibilities emerge. However, what happens when the humus and fossil fuels become distributed unevenly, also disturbed, I guess, so that certain places can remain focused on the green while others become strip-mined, fracked, deforested, and impoverished? What is happening during this contemporary era of globalization and climate weirding is that a certain segment of the population of human beings is literally living at such a pace that we are outstripping the reproductive capacities of the planet. As Rob Nixon points out, perhaps the dreams and hopes that emerge from the fast-paced fossil-fueled reality are quite literally out of this world. What is called for, then, are perhaps some spiritual, ethical, emotive, and imaginative cartographies that help us map these inequities. Many of us are familiar by now with the IPCC climate change assessment reports, which have been published roughly every 5 to 7 years since 1997. Each report includes emission scenarios with cones of possibilities for what types of things to expect given the particular scenario. There are 4 basic models with really boring names, now called, they used to be A1, A2, B1, B2, but now they're RCP 8.5, RCP 6.0, RCP 4. Anyways, I don't know why they named them this way. There are 4 basic models moving in general from business as usual in terms of the fossil-fueled expansion and economic growth based upon that expansion, toward transitions toward renewables and equitable economic growth. Interestingly, the reports include social and political changes that need to take place in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate change, ranging from gender equity in education, migration issues, reliance on social networks, to, in the latest report, quote, individual and collective assumptions, beliefs, values, and worldviews influencing climate change responses. So the scientists are on board with religion and nature in this report. It is here where our spectral cartographies of values, beliefs, and goals begin to materialize and matter for the planetary community. What on earth might this look like? Will theologians now have to add levels of training that include geographic information systems? I hope not. Maybe not, but we should at least offer those working with GIS or even mental modeling software some parameters to work within. The invitation is there. Assuming here that all theology is about theoanthropology, I'm not interested in mapping God. I'll leave that to folks who have much more of a direct line than I do. Let me here offer a partial scenario of a spiritual cartography, however. Given that we are in the heart of process country, I figure it's okay to poke fun of the omni-understanding of God a bit. So let's start with a bit of omnipresence. Many, most famously Feuerbach and others, have argued that our articulation of the divine results in making ourselves in the divine, in the image of that divinity. Right? We become that which we think is God. How has the desire for omnipresence been in part materialized over the course of the fossil-fueled era? How has this desire transformed our modes of transportation and communication? By foot, by animal, by steam, by coal, oil, nuclear energies, and now instantaneously through the virtual realities on the internet. What does the mapping of this theology turned anthropological desire look like? Can we color code the ecological footprint of belief in an omnipresent God turned desire to be omnipresent? How has such a desire affected Earth bodies differently according to race, gender, class, ability, sexuality within the human community, and differently according to species beyond the human? How has such a desire affected the green of forest ecosystems, the blue of oceanic systems, and the brown of Earth systems? Note, I'm not laying the blame here on theologies of omnipotence. Okay, but am simply trying to analyze how such a belief within a whole system of complex beliefs might materialize in the world around us. This tendency toward theoanthropology makes apophasis and negative theologies of the kind that Catherine speaks of in The Cloud all the more important. If our ideas of God, justice, love, ultimate value, etc., become a container, then we have no choice but to move toward that container and become like that God. Move within that container and become like that God. Quoting here, if theologians transcend our non-knowing in the name of Jesus, revelation, or even justice, we practice Christian idolatry, says Catherine, end quote. If closure cuts us off from our relationality and begins to cipher all relations into material conceptual containers, then let's let gravity, or gravitas, do its work and break open our material conceptual containers onto the planetary community of which we are a part. So part 3, gravity action or gravitation. Wait for it. Defying gravity, as usual, with a spectral ethics of probability, for those of you that like Wicked. Okay, so quoting Abrams here, who is David Abram, who's much more poetic than I'll ever be, we mistakenly think of our flesh as fixed and finite form, a neatly bounded package of muscle and bone and bottled electricity, with blood surging its looping boulevards and byways. But even the most cursory pondering of the body's manifold entanglements, its erotic draw toward other bodies, its incessant negotiation with that grander eros we call gravity, suffices to make evident that the body is less a self-enclosed sack than a realm wherein the diverse textures and colors of the world meet up with one another, end quote. As Abrams so poetically puts it, gravity is about the eros of bodies attracted to other bodies. Gravity is the attraction that makes our every movements on this earth possible. It's at once a constraint, but the type of constraint that allows for freedom and proliferation of possibilities in terms of the bodies that fold in and out of one another throughout evolution and on a daily basis. Gravity, gravitas, eros, opens us onto the multiplicity of living, evolving bodies on this planet. It is in and through these bodies that our own bodies exist and persist, and it is with these bodies that we move forward toward possibilities for our future. Mapping bodies, as was argued in the previous section, will give us a prismatic view of the effects of our religious, ethical, and other beliefs on the multiplicity of bodies. Once we understand our own bodies in the context of this deeply open and relational reality, again, Catherine notes that we begin to see that the individual viewpoint only takes place in its interdependence with the others. The more eyes, the more vision, end quote. This multi-perspectivalism helps us to discern better at any one moment of mapping what our possibilities might be for moving forward toward a different planetary future. Far from slowing us down, gravity opens us onto this prism of possibilities and increases our freedom to move spectrally, respecting the way in which all possibilities are interconnected and what it will mean for particular bodies when we begin to move towards some and not towards others. As we move forward and possibilities become realities and non-realities, even the past will be remembered in different ways from the new grounds we co-create. Such changing of stories always seems to occur. As many have pointed out, the stories of Western monotheistic theology help to support a world of Newtonian mechanics, just as the more relational ontologies of Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism have helped physicists think about special relativity and quantum mechanics. Our narratives of the world, whether religious, philosophical, or other, help to reshape the way in which we see and understand the world. Arguably, one strong holdout from a certain type of monotheistic theology is that of the idea of creation ex nihilo. Mary Jane Rubenstein does a fantastic job of making the rhetorical and conceptual connections between ex nihilo and Big Bang cosmology in her most recent book. Perhaps some understanding of the multiverse might open newly imagined possibilities for the future and give us new eyes with which to see and materialize the world in different ways. And yet another attempt to revisualize and materialize, I don't know what I just said there, okay. And yet another attempt to revisualize and materialize, let's take some time to reflect about rainbow gravity. I did not make up this term. It was already out there. It was just like waiting for me to find. In this theory, there is no beginning to the universe, no Big Bang, no creatio ex nihilo. Further, there is a kind of particle-based perspectivism according to this theory. As one article puts it, quote, "The color of light is determined by its frequency, and because different frequencies correspond to different energies, light particles, photons, of different colors would travel on slightly different paths through space-time according to their energy," end quote. Different frequencies, different paths through space-time, different embodiments, multiple ways of becoming. This is highly speculative, but speculation is precisely what helps us materialize in different ways of becoming. We need spectral thinking in order to discern the spectrum of possibilities. If all of our alternative seizing does not include speculation, then we'll be adrift in space-time, unaware of the grounds on which we stand. Gravity helps to position bodies in different ways of becoming, and thus helps to diffract on the pluralistic ethics and politics that become possible in different planetary contexts. In other words, just as there is not one perspective, and just as no one Earth body will experience the effects of our enacted beliefs, meanings, and values in the same way, so there cannot be a single common way of moving forward from a planetary present. What may seem inconsistent from a substance-based metaphysics of separate entities, all with essential natures and teleological purposes, is precisely the disorderly, inconsistent, seemingly hypocritical flip-flopping that is required when acting with uncertainty. Rather than maintaining an ideologically consistent framework and forcing the principles that result from that framework onto all places, we need a flexible framework that allows us to open onto the different contours of our geolocations and the multiple perspectives therein. As Tom Bolstorff suggests in his anthropological work on the Indonesian archipelago, an understanding of the archipelagic self might better suit us here. This means different island, different identity, or in the context of the ancient world, different city, different place, different God, right? I would extend Bolstorff's model to the planetary scale because it has something to tell us about what it means to be human in an era of climate change and globalization. We must be flexible and open to oceanic possibilities that emerge in situations. Just a quick example will suffice here. In speaking with some volunteers for a community health center in Indonesia again, that deals with everything from abortion to HIV prevention and education, and LGBTQ advocacy in Indonesia, which is not an easy thing. One of the organizers told me after a long discussion of queer theory, which I gave, which everybody fell asleep to, that their organization had I was much more interested in the activists in the room, had to say, but anyways, that their organization had a sort of double standard when it came to speaking about LGBTQ issues. When they're trying to change the minds of citizens about the need for equal rights of LGBTQ peoples in a predominantly Muslim, albeit Indonesian-style Muslim, which is much different than most of it, than what's conjured up by the idea of Muslim usually in the United States, the message is clear. Baby LGBTQ peoples were born this way. Another song reference, thank you. When they are holding seminars and consultations with LGBTQ persons, then the message is not so clear. They can speak freely about the fluidity of gender, sex, and sexuality. It's a version of strategic essentialism that depends upon the island or context that one finds oneself in. We all do it, but we don't necessarily own it. To put it into our familiar context, for the general public, gay marriage, yes. Yes. While for a different sort of audience, let's abolish the legal rights and privileges associated with marriage across the board and recognize all types of relationships, romantic and non, free healthcare for all, and wealth redistribution rather than biological inheritance generation after generation. So double standard there. A second feature of this type of contextual planetary ethics is that ideals, principles, and values can be seen as hopes and desires rather than markers of any essential features of embodiment in the world. As Judith Butler noted, words such as democracy and woman are really political desires and intentions rather than markers of anything essential to ontology. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights also operates in this political way. The problem with assuming woman, democracy, or human rights as essential to reality is that such essences seldom account for the variations expressed by those concepts. If you don't exhibit or contain X, then you're not part of the club. Identity politics cascade into multiple points of diffraction because no voice speaks for the experience of what it means to be white, black, male, female, trans, gay, straight, and or other. Queer studies is in part a way in which to highlight this prismatic and processive understanding of identities. Hardly a queer theorist, Jürgen Moltmann, following Hans Jonas, recognized this in terms of the Imago Dei. Bucking the essentialist trend of interpreting the Imago tradition, Moltmann suggests that living into the Imago Dei is something to work towards in relationship to other humans and the rest of the natural world. It's not a given. If we think of humans, rights, traditions, and other concepts in this way as imaginative suggestions towards a not yet realized reality, as cartography, or as something we can only attain in certain breakthrough relational moments, then we can understand that changes to identity markers that expand what it means to be woman, human, man, black, brown, white, gay, straight, trans, Christian, Buddhist, etc., are expansions of these markers, and thereby every expansion becomes a more power-filled understanding of the given concept. Such a shift in thinking from essence to process looses power from those in the center and gives it to those ever-expanding concepts, theories, and identities at the edges and margins. Such expansions, in a sense, enable us to diffract these concepts and open us onto the spectrum of becoming within the planetary community. Thank you. So, 10 minutes.
Perfect. Yes, let's take 10 minutes and prismatically engage.
I really like the end of the paper, and I like also at the end the emphasis on coming of the Imago Dei and the process. I find something similar in the work of Catherine Tanner. She says something like that too, in a different way than most understand. But I also struggle with it, and here's why. Because if you, for instance, look at the work of Desmond Tutu, who claims in South Africa the importance of the Imago Dei to give people of color, in the sense that they are created in the image of God, and that it's very powerful and very affirming. So I'm struggling with that for that reason.
Yeah. So that's again, I would use this double standard, right? Mm-hmm. In situations like that, yes, rights, identities. I mean, of course, they matter in very real ways. At the same time, on this level, I would say that, you know, the very problem with assuming human rights or assuming these categories is that they don't fit, right? Human rights are violated all the time. We haven't achieved universal human rights. And so just saying that everybody has rights sort of doesn't give it to them, right? It's a process that we have to go through to get there. It's not as easy as just saying it, you know? And that's a perfect example, right? Ending apartheid and sort of working through all that. That is the process of human rights becoming, I would say. Okay. Or the imago, living into the imago, if you will. Mm-hmm. That's at least how I think about it. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Kind of just jumping in here a little bit between you and Moltmann and process thought, actually, or maybe process thought is the between jump that might say, isn't there actually a way very strongly affirming the actual experience of, you know, you at a certain moment as definitely, you know, like gay defined with that so-called identity, or black defined, or me as woman, at least in 1982, I really was, and yet, you know, it's okay to let that exclamation point burst there with its full embodiment, already expressive of what we call the Imago Dei, you know, already beginning to realize it. You know, the problem with Moltmann, or rather with misinterpretations perhaps of Moltmann's eschatology, is that it's a complete deferral. And it's very hard to talk about the process. In the meantime, there is that which is to come in the end, and he really does mean end, yeah. And therefore becoming is degraded. You know, and Derrida gets into some of that too, the to come versus the becoming. but isn't there a way to say, you know, I am now African American, or I am now lesbian, with the fullness of that identity, precisely in becoming and in opening up the complexity of what that means. This is just, I think, for our long-term reflection. That
yeah, absolutely. Yes.
In which case, it's not a pure double standard anymore.
Right.
An emerging
it's kind of
complexity.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly right. That it's that things like the imago or liberation or enlightenment are all these things are sort of breakthrough moments, and nobody can do it all the time. But they're, you know, that doesn't take away from the gravity of them or the process by which we get there and this sort of thing. I mean, nobody except for maybe some Buddhist monks can be like walk around enlightened all the time. You know? But we can have those moments, right? And I feel like it's capturing those that reality that these ideals are the way in which I'm looking at the imago is trying to get at.
But the moments of becoming are also moments of, I think, realization of relationships in a certain way. When I articulate, you know, what it means to be a woman, I put myself in all kinds of relationships, and that is also true with race, and so these are moments of insight, and maybe we should say that. The Imago Dei is, in a sense, an impossible thing to achieve. Maybe what we can achieve is to grow closer to Christ as the Imago Dei in a kind of indirect way. And with that comes a sense that claiming identity is seeing the complexity of relationships yeah, the pain and joy that comes with it.
Yeah, I agree.
You agree?
Yeah.
I couldn't help as you were talking for some reason. My brain was curious things, but as you were mentioning spectrum and spectral, I also kept thinking about the hauntedness. Colors haunt us, identities haunt us, former identities, potential identities, you know, in a way that mark us, that might lead something that we can't necessarily identify, and there might be a certain hue to that. So I wonder if you had thought about how you could kind of, I mean, you're doing a lot of plays with the gravitas and the process as well, which is really fun. I wonder if you had thought about, because we also think of a spectral or spooky figure, there's that blurring of lines between colors, between identities, before kind of becoming light, you know, was it between spaces maybe?
Definitely like a Derridian hauntology will pop its way in there in the longer version of this, and also the whole idea of spooky effects in quantum physics, I think, are part of this. I mean, those things popped in my head when I was, definitely thinking about this. So, and hopefully they'll end up in the longer paper. So, yeah.
And I was actually the William Padilla was there's a little spooky and conversation maybe later.
Great, yeah.
I can resist making those two connections with, like, you know, colors are like whiteheads, you know, sorry to wax. I shouldn't apologize for wax whiteheading.
Yeah.
This is
the place to do it.
You know, colors are one of his primary examples of kind of simple eternal objects, you know, because they're these things that sort of like green shows up in all these different places, but it's the same green, right? So there's this kind of form, there's this kind of whatness, right? That like, and that's what kind of gives things, you know, life and the world, its kind of structures of continuity in a way, because these things kind of repeat themselves, you know, and they kind of create patterns, structure, and order. And you know, so he does this whole thing with Hume, where like Hume is, you know, saying that, look, like everything comes from, you know, knowledge, the perception or something. But then Hume is like, but I guess you could imagine, like, you know, a color, a shade of blue maybe that you've never seen before, that's in between a really dark blue that you've seen and a really light blue that you've seen, right? And then so Whitehead seizes on that. He's like, see, Hume doesn't really, like Hume found his own crack. And so where's this going? There's something about I don't know, imagining colors that we haven't seen before. Or the sense in which, we think of things as being these different colors, but colors are sort of are what's knitting together this diversity, this sort of and these eternal objects are being sort of re-knitted together, and it's not the blueness that matters, it's the contextuality, and it's the way blueness matters differently, right, in each kind of becoming, right, and how these things weave together, and how there are all these spectrums, right, that we can't even see, right, but flowers and that bees can come to, and they see this crazy, amazing psychedelic, pattern,
right.
That you have to be on that frequency to see. So I don't know, I'm just kind of expanding the metaphors, but anyway.
Definitely, I listened to a paper from an apiist, not an atheist, but an apiist, a person who, I didn't know what that was until somebody told me it was a person who studies bees, but anyways, fun little term. Everybody always thinks I said atheist, so anyway, then they were like, why are atheists talking about bees? But anyway, she was an atheist, and both of her parents were geometry professors at Vanderbilt, and she was studying the bee woggle, and she noticed there were patterns, and so she gave it to her parents to look at, and they're like, oh yeah, this is a 5-dimensional figure, the charting of the bee woggle dance is this 5-dimensional figure. So then she started thinking, oh, maybe bees experience the world in 5 dimensions, it's kind of an imaginative fun thing, but yeah.
Well, I think we need to take a break.